briefly.
Great. Well, I'll pick up around there, around 2013, 2014 when I joined, and talk through the last few years. And then I also wanted to talk, kind of zoom out and talk about the bigger context of harm reduction in the United States in the past, say, decade or two. And then maybe think about some of the lessons from all this like amazing history that we've heard about. So basically what NEED looks like now, like Mark said, you know, we have our sites, our 3 sites around the city. We do outreach in People's Park. We provide naloxone. We do basically distribution up to 400 syringes per person, much as we've done for many years. We're funded by the city mostly. We also are getting some money from the county, and a new development in the last few years is getting support from the state Office of AIDS, which has been a big change and I think has the potential to really sort of change the game for syringe exchange in California. And so what that translates to is we give out around 550 to 600,000 syringes every year, which is a lot. We're seeing physically at our sites over 1,000 people a year, and each of those people on average is seeing another 4 or 5 people beyond them. So we reach a lot of people, and even though our sites are just in Berkeley, we collect zip codes from people, and we see folks from all over Alameda County, from Oakland, from the rest of the county, from Contra Costa, from Solano County. We have people who come from Vallejo on a regular basis, people who come from Stockton on a regular basis, people who come from as far away as Nevada County, out in the eastern part of the state. Which is impressive, and is a testament to how well the distribution model works in getting people what they need so that they're willing to drive that far and don't have to do it as often as they would otherwise. And we're still one of the few exchanges that uses that model in the Bay Area, even though...
In California.
In California, in the country maybe. Even though the research, you know, stuff that Julia was working on 15, 20 years ago, like that research says that it's the way to go. We have probably about 30 or 35 volunteers now, so it's a pretty big organization, and we still do run as much as we can with a group of that size and a very varied group of people as a collective. So we meet as a collective twice a year, and we make decisions by consensus, and we really try to remain true to that spirit. But I think that the history of NEED as an organization is in some ways a really wonderful exception that proves a lot of rules about how organizations develop, especially when money gets involved. And so NEED was part of sort of a generation of syringe exchanges in the late 80s and early 90s. There were more than a dozen of them that cropped up in California, mostly in the Bay Area, but kind of up and down the coast. And a lot of them started very informally as, you know, groups of people who use drugs, or friends of people who use drugs, people who had medical training, didn't have, or health training, didn't have any health training, were involved in a bunch of different activist projects. And so NEED was, like a lot of other organizations, though, had this very particular lineage because it was in Berkeley, of all places. But over the years, to survive, a lot of those organizations have had to transform into much more conventional not-for-profit agencies where they have full-time staff, where there's very little political involvement, and if there is political involvement, it's very, you know, conventional advocacy, and they've kind of lost the direct action spirit and the radical edge that NEED had. And I think of the organizations from that period that have survived in any recognizable form, NEED is the one that's done the most work to stay true to that kind of organization and spirit, and to always, with the limited resources that we have, push the envelope a little bit on what we can offer. And I think, so that's sort of where we are right now. We've encountered some challenges that have kept us in the treading water phase longer than we might have wanted to be. So we had been getting money consistently for a while from the Syringe Access Fund, which is run by it's administered by AIDS,
United.
Yeah, AIDS United, but the money sort of filters down from NASN as well, and so it's part of this sort of larger canopy of national harm reduction that supports local organizations. We lost that funding last year, and so we've had to scramble to find new funding. And so now we're getting money from both the city and the county and from the state. And the state money is coming because Jerry Brown actually got money, dedicated money in the state budget for the first time, several $1,000,000 to support local syringe exchanges. And so that means that money can sort of, in the form of supplies, go to local organizations and really encourage, for the first time since the 90s, a next wave of syringe exchanges starting in places in California that either didn't have enough syringe exchange or didn't have it at all, particularly places away from the Bay Area where there are lots of activists hanging around who are willing to get arrested and sort of push the envelope. I think one other lesson from needs history, though, that we should remember as that happens is that it's really easy to do needle exchange if all you mean is that you're giving needles out. It's a lot harder to do it in the way that we've tried to do it, which is, very locally grounded, responsive to people's needs, not dictating what or coercing what people have to do to access our services. And I think the danger of all of this money pouring down from the state and also from the federal level, which I'll talk about a little bit, is that we drain out, as a result of the way that those bureaucracies work and the expectations they have, that we drain out a lot of the grassroots, horizontal, non-judgmental, really peer-driven aspects of the organizations that made them so successful in the early years and that made programs in places like New York City so ineffective at reaching people. So I think that's something that is still a tension that we're negotiating, even though it's not a new one at all, and I'm struck from listening to David, like how much has changed, but also how much has not changed, and we're still fighting a lot of the same battles. And the sort of wish list of programs that David and Julia talked about overdose prevention and wound care and starting a really robust satellite exchange program, all those things are things that we either want to do or have accomplished a little bit but want to expand. And so it's kind of frustrating that we're still, that in some ways we're still where we were. But I think the context has changed a lot. So obviously needle exchange started as a response to HIV and to hepatitis C. But as Julia mentioned, it's sort of been leapfrogged in the past decade or so in the sort of national conversation by overdose prevention and the problem of opioid overdose. So, you probably know some of the basics, but over the past 20 years, our consumption of prescription opioids in particular has quadrupled. Along with that, emergency room visits, substance abuse treatment admissions, and overdose deaths have also skyrocketed. We lose almost 50,000 people a year to drug overdose. About 60% of those overdoses involve opioids. That's more people than die in car crashes. That's more people than are killed by guns. It's a huge problem. And because so much of the opioid use now is driven by prescription medication, and by people, it's sort of upsetting a lot of the stereotypes that people have because, now it's, people that I know in my community who don't look like the junkies that I think of, that I associate opioid use with. And so that's sort of, they talk all the time, and I hate this phrase, the changing face of heroin and the changing face of overdose and of opioid use. And what that means is that middle-class people are being affected and more white people are being affected. And so that's meant that there's actually been a lot of legal and policy change on overdose prevention in the past few years. Nearly every state, including conservative states, have done one thing or another to loosen up access to naloxone, whether that means giving it to cops, whether that means putting it in clinics, whether that means distributing it like we do. And needle exchange is almost riding the coattails now of overdose prevention in places like Indiana and in places like North Carolina, Georgia, and other states that have only agreed to do needle exchange, which has been around for decades, when they had an overdose problem and when they had sort of gotten their feet a little bit wet with something resembling harm reduction through overdose prevention. So I think that there's a concern, like it's great that there's more attention to the issue, but again, the way that it's raised, there's always the concern that that we lose all of the politics and the history and the radical spirit that animated harm reduction in the early days and that made it so powerful. And that, going mainstream comes with more money but it comes with a lot of requirements, and as Mark mentioned, sometimes that's a very zero-sum kind of negotiation, and you lose people that are really valuable to an organization because you make a decision to, seek money one way versus another, to look one way as an organization rather than another. But I think that's all kind of depressing to think about, and I don't want to be depressing entirely, though it's depressing work sometimes. But I think that's something that's really positive no matter what to take away from the experience of need and of other syringe exchanges like it, is that you can really do, under the right circumstances, and if you pick your issues well, you can do both pretty aggressive protest and actually improve the lives of people in a concrete way. And that even if initially that wasn't the intention, that was the effect. And even if it takes a little more planning to be a sustainable organization and things like that, I think it's really wonderful to demonstrate that protest activity can actually move the ball forward, can actually be, it's really kind of a being the change that you wish to see kind of model, in that you're demonstrating through your very existence that a different kind of approach is possible. And if you're a group like me that has connections to the community, and that has the trust of the community, then you can hang on sort of by your fingernails just on the corner of San Pablo and Hearst every week and do really good work and still be a thorn in the side of people that don't want to go along with you. So I think that's a really great thing to remember, and I think that actually one of the things that could come out of the current attention to overdose is that we see a new generation of harm reduction that looks like that, specifically on the issue of supervised consumption facilities and doing more work around creating spaces where you're allowed to use drugs under the supervision of people who can intervene if there's a problem, so that you aren't using in the street or using in unsafe circumstances. And that would just be a really amazing game changer if it took on in changing the way that we treat drug use. And I think, already there are groups around the country that are letting people use drugs in their bathrooms, that are setting up rooms where people can use. And my hope is that in the next few years, just like 25, 30 years ago with needle exchange, there will be kind of a big coming out party, and in a few cities around the country, they'll be like, hey, we're actually doing this, and come and get us if you don't want us to. So I think that's like a really wonderful legacy or spirit that we can take away from need, from the history of need and kind of its origin story. And as for the future, I think, I came into the organization in the treading water phase, and so that was kind of the normal that I had. But I think that already we're thinking about a lot of exciting things, and if we can actually get the burden of just buying needles, which for decades was the problem, like how do we get money to buy needles if no one lets us use their money to buy needles? If we can get rid of that barrier, then we can really pursue some interesting stuff. So it's, not just how do we get more needles into the community, though that's something that we really want to do, but also addressing all of the secondary and associated kind of consequences of drug use, just like we were trying to do 20 years ago with wound care, with hepatitis C, not only testing and screening, but with treatment, since we now have really effective hepatitis C treatments that we can make available to people, buprenorphine and other kinds of medication-assisted therapies. And I think that those are all really wonderful possibilities that if we, pursue them aggressively and be creative and maybe, fudge here and there, as we have in the past, that we can not only, need sticks around as a model of how harm reduction started, and it's kind of a fossil, a living fossil, and it's wonderful in that regard, but I think that we also have the opportunity to be kind of a model of what harm reduction should look like in the next 10 or 15 years as well. I don't know, I think I probably ran through a lot of my notes there. So I don't know if any of you have anything else that you want to say, or if there are questions from everyone else.
I had something else that I wanted to see if totally forgot, and I guess we wanted to open it up to question. Did you have anything you wanted to? I wanted to ask you about your trip to Slovenia and when you were because we talked a little bit about what we were going to talk about it.
There was weird. Some of the things.
in the
Some of the
90s.
things that kind of shook us were. One of the things was patient voices in the of users, of the community of users, and we started to do this, and there was really very few examples around how injection drug users had a voice and had demands and did so. They were only looked at as victims and criminals, one or the other, and we didn't know. We started doing needle exchange. We didn't really know about that. And we learned about that from other examples. One example that I saw when in former Yugoslavia was a group called Stigma, which was an organization of users. And I went to their meetings and saw some of their stuff while I was there. And I was like, wow, this blew me away that it was just self-organized users. And Jack said that, and then I rambled off to Switzerland and saw these junkie parks, or needle parks they call them, where the police kind of got everybody, and there's one little spot in the city where you're allowed to use drugs, and people would go in there with just like people laying anywhere, blood, needles, everything, and supporters and helpers cleaning up and stuff like that. And that, to me, that was appalling. I was just like, oh my God, my poor little virgin ears. And that was another thing. And a few years later, I was like, we got to do something, but I don't want it to look like that. Where needle exchange was a tool of control, and harm reduction work was a control tool. So those two things, patient voices and needle parks. And then we started connecting with folks at the 2000, I think it was Oakland Harm Reduction Conference. People came down from Vancouver, and they told us about how crazy and out of control Vancouver was, because the area had been kind of compressed, and there was just like injection drug shooting galleries and dens and legal shooting injection facilities, and that was like way before we'd even thought about legal injection facilities, and the people came and told us all about that, and that was really eye-opening for us, those locations. But the key thing, I think, what David said and what Mark and Julia are referring to, was the voice of the users in guiding what we do. And I think that's the thing that's still like the key thing. And I think, just to repeat what David said, I think that's really an exciting thing that we can keep working with that, because that's really been what's pushed NEED along.
Though, just to sort of follow up on that, something I wanted to mention, I think that NEED has been really lucky being in Berkeley, being based in Berkeley, even though our reach is much beyond Berkeley, both because of Berkeley's history as an incubator for radical organizations and radical politics, but also because of the university. And so when it comes to things like research, but also just getting volunteers, the university is a great sort of funnel for that, of like Chip or Young, like a lot of our previous important volunteers, folks, or UC Berkeley or any of the other universities in Alameda County or nearby, a great funnel. But I think that the tension is always like, how do we sort of, as the generation grows older, or as the organization grows older and sort of generations of people passing out, how do we keep that spirit alive? How do we keep that connection to the streets alive if the people coming into the organization don't necessarily have those experiences? Mm-hmm. And there are people in the group now who have drug use experience, but I wouldn't say that's who's predominantly a volunteer in the organization. And I think that something that we have been able to do well is not only maintain enough volunteers to keep the services going, but also do a good job of onboarding people and training people and sort of passing on that spirit of being responsive, even if as an organization we aren't a group of former people who use drugs or people who actively use drugs, or things like that, the way that we might have been as a percentage or something more in previous
It was
decades.
a pretty high percentage.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So just to add on to that.
And I don't know if this is the note we would end on, but I'm just looking, I wrote something up. I've been trying to work like on giving more of a definition to harm reduction that's it's sort of inclusive of. I believe that it goes beyond just approaches to drug use or risky sex. I think there's a lot of, and we've touched on a lot of like the sort of philosophical stuff about, and I just wanted, I I think the social justice movement, part of it has been really important, and has informed probably all of us in our adherence to it, and I've also kind of posed the question like to random people that are seeking harm reduction services, say at the harm reduction therapy center or whatever, and like one of the things you hear is like it's the opposite of 12-step. It's the opposite of like abstinence only requirements, and it's interesting. There's a tension also between that attitude, but which it really does, offer a set of, in terms of people seeking services, but also seeking like behavioral change and just like self-definition. I think it's served as like a contrast from the recovery movement, but also it's also kind of this umbrella that like includes like anything that is working for you. Like we're not going to disrupt that. If 12-step works for you, then like we embrace that as some like making positive change. And the phrase "meeting people where they're at" is one that emerges a lot. And so there was a Facebook conversation between Ro Giuliano and Alan Clear that I saw a couple of years back that was like, what is going on with Wikipedia? Like the Wikipedia definition of harm reduction is like totally kind of limited and doesn't mention the social justice movement or like a drug user fueled movement or and so she wanted to work to rework that definition in terms of like online presence, and so I managed to capture some of those ideas in what I was writing for another project, which is called the Gay Agenda, but that's like it's a planner, kind of not unlike the Slingshot Organizer. It's in process right now, but Casper photographed the Hotties of Harm Reduction calendars that were for points of distribution, which is Catherine Swanson's needle exchange that is delivery exchange that was local and unfortunately lost its funding and is no longer active. But you should check out these calendars. They're also things that I want back, but they've got naked pictures of needle exchange workers, so feel free to pass them around. And we do have a little bit of time for like comments, questions, whatever.
And cake eating.
Cake eating. Yeah.
And we have t-shirts
petting,
as well.
bunny petting.
I guess it's just interesting to me, even though it's obvious, but still how stigmatized it is. It is. Because harm reduction is obvious. If there was a car accident, of course you're going to stop the bleeding or whatever. You're going to do what you need to reduce harm.
And you're going to put a seatbelt in the car, which is like the metaphor that we often use.
There you go, right. But it's so interesting how people were blind and I don't know what, just couldn't even think straight because of the stigma or whatever it was.
Well, there's the war on drugs that's probably lingering over it.
Right.
And there's the interesting confluence that David sort of talked about of that needle exchange was since it was a totally new idea and the people that were doing it in some places weren't connected to the community. They were seen as outsiders and invaders, and it was easy to see needle exchange as something very suspicious and even conspiratorial.
Right.
Because it was also it was an era where there were HIV and AIDS conspiracy theories that were widely held and still are widely held, and things like that, and needle exchange could easily fit into those kinds of narratives too.
Yeah,
And yet, throughout Berkeley, I think people have always had a good relationship with need. Like whenever I'd be driving the van and people would be like, "Oh, hey, how you doing?" Or like I would describe what I do, and they're like, "Oh yeah, that's the blue van. Oh, I know that blue van." So
Yeah.
we've had very few bad experiences in Berkeley.
Compared to our friends in Oakland who had, a terrible time in the 1990s, for instance, getting arrested constantly and things like that.
And we also, I think that there's also a fair number of people that like get hassled or get incarcerated, and it's outside of our radar, or like slightly outside of our radar, where they're still, even though it's legal to carry needles, it's legal to carry clean needles, it's legal it's legal to carry dirty needles in any quantity as long as they're containerized. Now, but I think that people are doing jail time and getting a lot, and I hear about it every now and then, and it's sort of doesn't happen to us. It happens to our participants outside of the realm of or outside of like sight. So there's still work to do, and it's not we don't do police outreach very much. It's kind of that's a challenge.
Do you think one of the challenges to all of this area is, because I think about it a lot, is the basic tenets of capitalism? Like if drug use were like, okay, it's funded, like we don't even have public restrooms like that are just accessible, and I think some of us have known about going to the bathroom. So, but if it was something like, okay, you need somebody will be down here in 3.5 minutes, and because when someone's, a regular user, it's oxygen, water, substance. It's like that's significant. And I think that, if things, and the word was out, or there was a connection. I'm not going to talk about an organized, but organizational, but, that there wasn't like something cut with something really bad going around, or something like that. That's what I'm saying. The drug use would just be like, okay, you washed your socks and your underwear, and that's the way it goes. And I think that's, I think it's, I'm going to say this, I think it's appalling that people shouldn't be able to choose what substance they want to put in their own bodies and share with their friends. It's just like, who's deciding for whom? And you're supposed to pee in a jar for them? I mean, years later, something is going to be like, what would they do? I mean, it's just like outrageous. So, to round edges and mitigate some of the effects of this craziness that you appreciated very, very, very much. And I think it's really important that we don't forget that, because it hurts people physically, and the jail system is like literally popping at the seams. So, I mean, it isn't just how do we philosophically and what should we, it's like happening, it's outrageous. And, to hear, good stuff that people are doing to help each other is always really positive.
Well put.
Thank you for bringing that up. I think that's those are really important points. And I find myself in conversations with people in the public health world about, or avoiding conversations with people in the public health world about tobacco, because like tobacco is one of those, like, we fought the war against the big tobacco companies, and so now we make laws about, and law after law after law, and prevent, ban it and tax it and all the and have tobacco free everywhere. And it's, it's kind of nice not to have secondhand smoke like right in your face everywhere you go, because I do remember that. But it feels like it's, it's very much like being a harm reductionist. You just, like, the agency, the taking away of agency, and the sort of like it feels like they're going too far.
Yeah, though it's like to go. I think that there's a lot in what you said, and like a lot of different ways you could take it. Because some people, there's been the critique of needle exchange that it's like just a new way to get people under control, and you're like hooking them into the system, and it's like a ploy to get people hooked back in. You know, it's to make them. It's essentially not to fix the problem. It's just to bandage people up enough that they can be fed back into the machine, right? So their drug use isn't too much of a problem for them to work and to do everything else that they're supposed to do to be a good capitalist citizen. I don't think that's what we do, but I think there is the potential for that. But I think almost the deeper point is that because the substances that people have available to them are available on a market, whether it's a legal market like tobacco or an illicit market like opioids, they're already having a lot of their agency removed. So it's like, yeah, we should let people buy their cigarettes, but the cigarettes they're getting sold are being sold to them by like awful corporations that are filling them with all kinds of terrible chemicals and stuff. And similarly, you know, in the opiate world, like people might want to go out and buy heroin, and like that's great. I have no problem if you want to go out and buy heroin. But what we're seeing now is people think they're buying heroin, and because of the DEA cracking down and because of the increases in demand for the drugs, the cartels and stuff that actually run the distribution are cutting it with fentanyl and finding all kinds of even like animal tranquilizers that they can put into the supply to make the stuff stronger. And so then people like don't even know what they're buying, right? So there are all these layers to how like just the presence of a market mechanism, and then add the fact that all the stuff that we do is free, is always going to be free, couldn't work if it wasn't free, and that we're constantly scrounging to get a few pennies here and there to do this super cheap service so that we don't have to charge people for it. Like there are all kinds of challenges that like needle exchange is kind of the tip of the spear, just starting to provide a free service. But if you go further, it's like, well, if we really want to reduce the harm, we have to get the market out of drug use, because otherwise people are always going to be buying products that they don't have a lot of control over, and that are going to be carrying all kinds of unintended consequences as a result. So I think that's it's a huge problem.
Thank you. And I want to throw out one more thing.
Yeah.
I don't hear people talking about it, but there was a time back when in the movies, like in Frank Sinatra days and all that, you're going to stay home. Well, if you want to go to sleep, there's something, take that. And if you want to, wake up, there's, something, take that. And if you don't know what you want to do, take one of these. And like
Mama's little yellow pills.
Yeah. But and now there's in TV, the major TV celebrities in the not sitcoms, I don't know, the weekly shows, in the drinking. They drink when they feel happy. They drink when they go out. They drink when they're sad and when there's a tragedy. They're constantly, the whole thing is go to a bar or have wine at home, or and it's like a proliferation of alcohol. And it's not just you see a scene once in a while. And that's really distressing to me. I'd rather see people fixing with clean needles. And I advocate for that myself. I don't want someone with the legal system to get, messed up. But aside from that, I would say stay high, but not stay drunk.
Well, that's the other market piece, right? Is like tobacco and alcohol are the really dangerous drugs, and the reason that they're legal is because they've got powerful industries that took hold early enough that they could, keep the law off their back. So yeah, I think that's a great point too.
That sounds like another discussion group that I'd love to be part of. Like,
really bad.
And I think, it's really been a treat to come and speak here, and thank you guys for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you for all of your hard work. That's a good point, though. In terms of harm reduction, it's ironic that the drugs that are legal are actually more harmful in many ways.
Well, and there's actually, like, now there are people doing research. Like, if you look, the states that have more less less restrictive marijuana laws. So places that have medical marijuana and that have legal marijuana also tend to have lower rates of opioid abuse and opioid overdose because they're substitute drugs, right? Like maybe, you know, if we let people use not only smoke weed more, but use really good quality medical marijuana products, then they won't need these highly addictive, very dangerous opioid pills anymore. Or they won't want to use them anymore. They'll prefer to use the THC. So I think that there's all. I mean, yeah, it's and the opioid thing is a huge pharmaceutical. I mean, the CDC, the FDA just last year approved like a new super like high concentration hydrocodone pill. Like we still don't learn this lesson, even though their own advisory board was like, we don't need this drug, but it's a moneymaker, and so it's like we haven't learned.
Patented.
Yeah, we haven't learned the lesson at all.
Sure.
So.
Well, what we are seeing, right, with coming out of Afghanistan, that we're not, Bayer doesn't have access to the opium fields in the same way. And so we're seeing in Western medicine this big push against opioid use. And now the change in the pharmacy prescriptions and the higher use of heroin and the more need for needle exchange is a direct relationship to pulling out of Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think that people don't make those connections in terms of social justice and how it really affects medicine, you know, and if you're an IV drug user, you know, like we're talking about the best of respect in the community, but if you go into the Western medical system, you're not going to get the liver transplant, you're not going to, you know, you're going to be criminalized for your behavior. And so I think it's also real important to talk about the treasure of respect that you've always provided to the community, because that is not the norm. And we're seeing more heroin use with this pullback from Afghanistan, and I think it's real important to make those connections about war, militarism, and drugs.
Well, and I think the other connection, because actually most of the U.S.'s heroin comes from Mexico and Central America as well, and it's like the same thing. Like we started drug war in Mexico, the cartels ratchet up their violence, they start changing their distribution patterns. We get more dangerous heroin coming into the U.S. because it's cut with different things. I mean, it's all over the world, right? That those consequences, you know, spraying the fields overseas, it always ends up back here one way or another. And it's the most vulnerable people who have no control over the drugs that they're forced to buy who end up bearing the burden of that, you know.
Can I ask you something, please? Was I reading into what you were saying correctly? The military gives, and the one thing I personally think that's great, unfortunately it's in a system that gives with one hand and slaps the hand with the other, gives hard drugs to the soldiers at some point.
Oh yeah, every point.
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know how
that's-
you're going on combat because you get your speed. Everyone's on speed. I mean,
I think that's great, personally. I don't care, everyone can argue.
it helps you to shoot people. Pharmaceutical speed is great. It really helps you to
But
shoot
but we
people.
could do they could do something else. They were pointed to something else.
I'm just being real.
Okay, okay, but
That's the military. You know, I'm
That's the-
military. I mean,
Keep
Yeah,
it focused, yeah.
yeah. So the military is really an asset to people who want to do drugs.
No, what I'm saying is that because of the war in Afghanistan, a lot of our soldiers were guarding poppy fields for Bayer. And that's a big push to opioid use and getting everyone on opioids. I'm in my 60s. Every time I went into the doctor's office until 2 or 3 years ago, I was given a bottle of Vicodin. Because I'm old and I definitely need it. And that
I get offered pills all the
we
time.
had a 10-year, you know, during the time of the wars, we really had a big push around opioids, and I think it's important to look at that. And now that we've withdrawn from that and we don't have that same protection, now we have a whole new reality around pain meds and how you get your pain meds. And
Well, and there's also been a crackdown in
Yeah.
response to this, you know, the high visibility epidemic of prescription pain medication, and so the crackdown you've seen. Okay, there's, you know, like you go to the pharmacist
no refills. That's a good
Right,
example.
the pharmacist website is like, you know, like the pharmacists are, you know, gatekeepers that are really being addressed by drug partners for Drug Free America and all this stuff, and so like there's been this transition back into heroin because people can't, you know, the prescription opioids cost more. They can't get them from the doctors or pharmacists that they usually can get, and that's kind of the story. You see also like Appalachia, and East Coast, and Midwest, and stuff like that. Probably here too, but I'm thinking of like national figures, and it's
I got a lot of
So
family
it's-
members in Ohio.
Uh-huh.
Down Oxy, and they're doing heroin now because they can't get
A lot of sweats.
family members.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Yeah, I have a lot of relatives in Ohio in particular.
yeah.
Serious.
Yeah, and I hadn't put together about Afghanistan. So
Oh my God,
That's
yeah. I
really-
mean, you
that's-
talk to
thank
so
you
many
for bringing it
soldiers,
up.
and what they were doing was guarding bear, poppy fields.
Mm-hmm.
They're, I mean, this, it's horrible.
But beer is. No, I know. I'm just speaking like from a naive viewpoint, which sometimes I go. It's all at the same time because I live right down the street from beer, like a couple of blocks. And they're private industry.
Mm-hmm.
So the taxpayers are not only supporting the use of, I know they're using it for killing, they could be drawing or dancing, I don't care, hypothetically, I'm gonna say that, but or tearing down walls and building them up, but anyway, they're also like private, so the taxpayers are supporting. And you see it with
It's
Chevron.
capitalism. It's just pure capitalism,
Capitalism, and
and
you
people
see it
don't
with
understand
Chevron.
the nature of capitalism and war. And I think when you're a soldier, you start to see those things. And
Yeah.
How it's supporting private industry but not supporting the well-being of beings.
And also that it wasn't until we were pulling out that we decided we're going to deal with our pain problems. That it was perfectly fine for what was happening.
Right.
And to continue
Right.
with that until
Yeah, no,
we
you really
cut
just
off
made
the
that quick for
supply.
me. I mean, I remember when Taliban was like, oh, no more heroin is leaving, or no more poppies are leaving
Who
the country.
said
The Taliban was like,
Oh,
banned. I mean, that didn't last very long, probably because of the like international pharmaceutical companies that have their big like investments there. But I don't have a great understanding for that piece of it. But yeah, I can see how that it lines up historically. And yeah.
Plus, you have so many military people coming back wounded that are addicted.
Yeah, we
you
see
know, I mean, there's
about
just so
that.
many of
You know,
us.
we
that
see
are-
like so many generations of vets that
Yeah.
like
So-
come and like.
But we have the best pharmaceuticals, and most of us get addicted in combat. I mean, I have a lot of friends of mine that they stayed in so they could get the drugs.
I think this is a hope.
Hey,
I
Julia,
think it's
you can have a
testing
shirt
and
if you want
very,
one.
very,
Oh
very
yeah,
good.
we have meat shirts too.
But I
Right, I know that,
I
but
think
these
whether
are not.
it's actually on the surface or known about and anyway, but not talked about, it's a conversation. I'm an advocate for a world where people use what they want and have that choice, and it's.
Is this on still?
I'm also against any kind of medication at all, that's what it is. If anybody has any issue and they don't give them something that makes them feel, oh yeah.
That was really awesome.
Really,
That's a
You guys, yeah,
for the opportunity.
I wish there were people, it's like ridiculous that you can get
I mean, I agree with you. It's just
so many
crazy.
people saying they're
I
not
have a number of people that have been like, I can't make it, but I want to see the video.
Yeah, well, there is a video, so.
The proper is email.
Cool. We'll work out so how I can distribute that out.
Yeah.
Well done. Thank you.
That was great.
Thanks
It's
for
very interesting.
coming. Thanks for being my transportation.
Did good.
Did you get
Oh my god, the rabbit. Wow. Okay.
That's your problem.
Where these chairs go.
Yay! Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Is Robert here? I don't know. Here. Robert, I'm gonna leave the couch in the front, is that okay?
I need help moving this table.
Okay. I'll
I've never seen Julia. Will you be here?
I only move this table.
Interesting to report. I was looking just explaining to
But may you live in interesting times is a curse, a Chinese curse. So.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Great. I'm not cursed. But actually, this was interesting. I mean,
Yeah,
that was
right?
really interesting.
Maybe you would try to hip hop?
Yeah, it's like the most social network ever. Very
Like a therapy. So chill.
No, it's okay.
Maybe you should tell us that. Okay.
I've tried.
Way in your way.
Because I know